The moment the officer tightened the handcuffs around my wrists, I knew I had entered a level of absurdity I never thought possible. The cool steel bit into my skin as I stared at the smug face of Marge Thompson, the self-proclaimed queen of the Homeowners Association, standing a few feet away with her arms crossed like she had just conquered a kingdom. The sheer audacity of it all, being arrested on my own land, for simply hunting because some power-hungry HOA president decided my property was actually theirs, was almost laughable. Almost. It had started just a few days ago when I arrived at the lakeside cabin my grandfather had left me. The place had been in our family for generations, a beautiful retreat tucked away from the chaos of modern life. The kind of place where the only sounds were the rustling trees, the distant hoots of owls, and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. I had driven up expecting a peaceful weekend, maybe some fishing, maybe some hunting. What I hadn't expected was to find a massive HOA-branded sign planted at the entrance, reading, "Private property, HOA members only. No trespassing." I had pulled over, blinking at the sheer nerve of whoever put it there. I didn't live in an HOA. This land wasn't even near a subdivision. The closest neighborhood was nearly 2 miles away, separated by dense woods and a winding dirt road. How on earth could an HOA claim dominion over my property? Annoyed, I yanked the sign from the ground and tossed it into the truck bed. If they wanted it back, they could come and ask me to my face. Not even an hour later, as I was settling in, a sharp knock rattled the cabin door. Standing there, wearing the type of blazer that screamed, "I make everyone's life miserable for fun," was Marge. She introduced herself as the president of the Willow Creek HOA and wasted no time before declaring that my property technically fell under their jurisdiction. I laughed. Out loud. "That's funny," I said, stepping onto the porch. "Because I have the deed, and nowhere on it does it say I owe the HOA a damn thing." Her lips pressed into a thin, self-satisfied smirk. "You may not have signed an agreement, but this land was designated for HOA oversight years ago. We have rules here, Mr. Carter, and I expect you to follow them." I crossed my arms, mirroring her stance. "That's cute. You know what else is cute? The fact that you're trespassing. So if you'd be so kind as to leave my property, that'd be great." That had set her off. She went on about how the HOA maintained community standards and how my presence, on my own land, was a violation of their guidelines. I should have shut the door in her face right then, but I wanted to see how far she'd take it. And boy, did she take it far. The next morning, I found a freshly installed fence blocking my driveway. A bright red sign was nailed to a post, "Access restricted." HOA property. Now I was pissed. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my bolt cutters, sliced through the lock, and yanked the gate open. If Marge thought she could claim my property through sheer force of will, she had another thing coming. That evening, I decided to go hunting, just like my grandfather and I used to. Dressed in my camo gear, rifle slung over my shoulder, I trekked into the woods, letting the crisp air calm my nerves. Then, just as I was tracking a deer, I heard the sirens. By the time I made it back to the clearing near my cabin, 2 cop cars had pulled up, their lights flashing. And there she was, Marge, standing with an expression of triumphant malice, waving her arms like she had just caught some notorious criminal. "That's him," she shrieked. "He has a gun. He's trespassing." Before I could even process what was happening, the officers were on me. One was barking orders to drop my weapon. Another had their hand on their holster. I carefully placed my rifle on the ground, hands up, because the last thing I needed was for this to go from stupid to deadly. "Sir, do you own this property?" the officer asked, as his partner tightened the cuffs around my wrists. "Yes," I said through clenched teeth. "And I have the documents to prove it." Marge let out a laugh. "That old paperwork doesn't matter. This land falls under the HOA now. He's hunting illegally on restricted land." The officer looked from me to her, then back again. His expression shifted slightly, like he was beginning to realize this situation was a hot mess. "Ma'am, you're saying this is HOA property?" She nodded. "That's correct. And you live where, exactly?" Marge hesitated for the briefest moment before puffing up her chest. "I live in the Willow Creek Estates, just a few miles down the road." The cop turned back to me. "And you're saying this is your private land?" I sighed, trying to keep my temper in check. "I don't just say it's mine. It is mine. I have the deed inside. You're welcome to check it." That's when Marge's composure cracked. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "You think just because you say something, it makes it true? The HOA has been maintaining this land for years. It belongs to the community. The officer who had been holding my arm loosened his grip slightly. He turned to Marge. So, just to be clear, do you have any legal documents proving this property belongs to the HOA? For the first time, she faltered. Well, she stammered, it's common knowledge. That's not what I asked. The cop's tone had shifted. He exchanged glances with his partner. Because if you're wrong, that means you just called in a false report. That's a crime, ma'am. Marge's face went pale. I was just trying to uphold community standards. I let out a breath, watching the officers as they exchanged looks before finally reaching for the keys to undo my cuffs. Sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding, the cop said as he freed my wrists. It seems like there's been some confusion here. I rolled my shoulders, stepping away. Yeah, no kidding. Marge, realizing things weren't going her way, huffed loudly. Well, you still can't hunt here. The HOA has rules. The officer cut her off. Ma'am, as far as I can tell, you don't have any authority over this property. If I were you, I'd leave before I start considering trespassing charges. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I stood there, arms crossed, watching her struggle to find words. It was glorious. Finally, with one last dramatic huff, she stomped back toward her car. This isn't over, she muttered before speeding off. I turned to the officers. You want to see the deed just to be sure? The cop laughed. I believe you. Just keep an eye out. She seems like the kind who doesn't take no very well. Oh, I knew that already. Because if there was one thing I was sure of, it was that Marge wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The drive back into town was supposed to be a quick supply run, but I was barely halfway through the hardware store when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I had a feeling I knew exactly who it was. Sure enough, the second I answered, an all-too-familiar voice came screeching through the speaker. You have made a huge mistake, Mr. Carter. Marge's voice was laced with venom. You may think you won this little stunt, but the HOA doesn't take kindly to rule breakers. I will be filing an official complaint against you, and you will regret ever crossing me. I sighed, grabbing a roll of duct tape from the shelf and tossing it into my cart. Marge, I don't know how else to say this. You don't own my land. Oh, but that's where you're wrong, she hissed. You'll see soon enough. Before I could even ask what the hell that was supposed to mean, she hung up. I stared at my phone for a second, shaking my head. Either she was bluffing, or she was actually deranged enough to try something. Considering she had already called the cops on me once, I figured it was safer to assume the latter. I finished my shopping and drove back to the cabin, half expecting to find another fence blocking my driveway. But when I pulled in, everything seemed normal. Too normal. I parked the truck and walked toward the porch when I noticed an envelope taped to the door. It was thick, official-looking, and had the words Willow Creek HOA stamped across the top. With a deep sigh, I ripped it open and scanned the first few lines. My jaw clenched as I read. Notice of property violation. According to HOA regulations, my property was now subject to community standards and oversight. The letter stated that I had committed multiple infractions, including unauthorized modifications to the landscape, reckless discharge of firearms, and my personal favorite, failure to submit proper architectural plans for existing structures. They were actually trying to find me. For my own cabin. I couldn't even be mad at the audacity. It was almost impressive. Almost. The next morning, I decided I had enough of the games. I took the notice straight to the county clerk's office, where I laid it on the counter in front of an older man named Rick, who had worked there since before I was born. He took one look at the paper, adjusted his glasses, and let out a long, slow whistle. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered, flipping through a massive book of property records. Ain't never seen the HOA try to claim something this far out before. I crossed my arms, waiting as he traced a finger down the records. They claim my land is under their jurisdiction. Rick snorted. That's a load of horse crap. This land's been in your family for decades. HOA has no legal standing here. That was exactly what I thought. But then Rick's face darkened. Huh. I repeated. What's huh supposed to mean? Rick frowned and turned his monitor toward me. Well, you're still listed as the owner, but a document was filed last week attempting to designate your property as common land under the HOA. My stomach tightened. What? That's not possible. Rick nodded grimly. Yeah, well, someone sure tried to make it possible. I see the signature right here, Margaret Thompson. Of course. I clench my fists. So what does that mean? Did she actually get control of my land? Rick shook his head. Not yet. She filed the request, but it still needs to go through a review process. And judging by the way this was submitted, it's full of more holes than a busted screen door. That was the first good news I had heard all day. So can I stop it? Rick nodded. Yep. You just need to submit a formal dispute. Given that you have the original deed and tax records proving ownership, it should be an open and shut case. That should have been the end of it. But deep down, I knew Marge wouldn't go down without a fight. I didn't have to wait long for her next move. That night, I was sitting on my porch with a cold beer in hand when headlights appeared at the end of my driveway. A sleek black SUV rolled up, and out stepped Marge, flanked by two men in suits. She had the same self-satisfied smirk she always wore when she thought she was in control. "Mr. Carter," she said sweetly, though her tone dripped with condescension. "I see you received our notice." I took a sip of my beer, not bothering to stand. "Oh, I got it. And I also went to the county office, where I found out you tried to steal my property." Marge waved a dismissive hand. "Steal is such an ugly word. We're simply ensuring the community maintains its integrity." I let out a short laugh. "There is no community here, Marge. My land isn't part of your HOA, and it never will be." One of the suited men cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, I'm Mr. Hayes. I represent the Willow Creek Homeowners Association in legal matters. I'd like to discuss this situation civilly." I gestured toward my porch. "Go ahead. I'm all ears." Mr. Hayes pulled out a folder and handed me a stack of papers. "The HOA has made substantial investments in maintaining and overseeing community spaces. Your property, whether you acknowledge it or not, falls within our designated area. We are prepared to offer you a generous buyout to officially incorporate your land into the HOA." I glanced at the number on the page. It was laughable. They were offering barely a fraction of what the land was worth. I tossed the papers back at him. "Not interested." Marge huffed. "You're being unreasonable, Mr. Carter. This is what's best for everyone." I stood, stepping closer. "No, what's best for everyone is you getting the hell off my property." Marge's face twisted in fury. "Fine," she snapped. "Then we'll handle this the hard way." She turned on her heel and stormed back to the SUV. Mr. Hayes sighed, giving me a pitying look. "You should reconsider, Mr. Carter. The HOA has a lot of resources. Fighting this could be very difficult." I smiled. "We'll see about that." As the SUV disappeared down the road, I let out a slow breath. If Marge wanted a war, she had just picked the wrong man to fight. Because I wasn't just going to win. I was going to make sure she regretted ever messing with me. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. Marge wanted to play dirty? Fine. I could play just as dirty, except unlike her. I had the truth on my side. I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA president steal my land just because she thought she could. If she wanted to claim authority, I'd make sure everyone saw just how much of a fraud she really was. I started by digging into the HOA itself. I spent the morning making phone calls, reaching out to a few locals I knew from town, especially those who had once lived in Willow Creek Estates. The stories I heard were almost unbelievable. Marge had been running that HOA like a dictatorship for years, and no one had been able to stop her. One woman, Mrs. Callahan, told me how Marge had fined her $500 for having the wrong shade of blue on her mailbox. Another man, Todd, had been threatened with a lawsuit for installing a small bird bath in his backyard without HOA approval. And the worst story of all? A retired couple had their property foreclosed on after refusing to pay thousands in ridiculous HOA fines that Marge personally issued. It became clear that this woman wasn't just on a power trip. She was a full-blown scam artist, using her position to intimidate and extort people out of their own homes. But no one had ever stood up to her. Until now. I knew that if I wanted to take her down, I needed something solid. A real smoking gun. And so I did something a little reckless. I attended one of the HOA meetings. I wasn't a member, of course, but I figured if Marge was bold enough to claim she owned my land, then I could be bold enough to walk into her little kingdom and see how things worked. The meeting was held in a stuffy community center, with the kind of folding chairs that made your back hurt just looking at them. The room was filled with a mix of homeowners, some looking frustrated, others defeated. And then, at the front of the room, sitting like a queen on her throne, was Marge. She spotted me immediately, her face twisting into a smirk. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "Mr. Carter, how lovely of you to join us." I took a seat near the back, folding my arms. Figured I'd see what all the fuss was about. Marge didn't like that. She glanced toward Mr. Hayes, the same lawyer who had tried to get me to sell my land. He looked uncomfortable, probably because he knew this was going to turn into a disaster. The meeting started, and within 10 minutes, I realized it was less of a meeting and more of a lecture from Marge on all the new community guidelines she was imposing. A new rule about what types of flowers could be planted. A ban on leaving trash cans out for more than a few hours. A new fee for road maintenance, even though the county handled the roads. Then came the part one was waiting for. As you all know, Marge said, glancing at me with a smug expression, we've had some issues with a certain individual who refuses to comply with community standards. Rest assured, we are taking the necessary legal steps to resolve this matter. I stood up. Oh, you mean me? The room went silent. Marge's eye twitched, but she forced a smile. Yes, Mr. Carter. You. I stepped forward, pulling out a thick folder I had brought with me. I've been doing some digging into this HOA of yours. And I've got to say, I've found some interesting things. Marge stiffened. You are not a member, so you have no right to speak here. I ignored her. For example, did you know that the HOA's financial records are supposed to be made public to its members? And yet, not a single person I spoke to has ever seen a breakdown of where their dues are going. A murmur ran through the crowd. Mr. Carter. I cut her off. And did you know that Marge here has been issuing fines that aren't legally enforceable? In fact, I have a report here from the county stating that multiple fines given out in the past year have been based on non-existent violations. Another round of whispers. Someone in the back muttered, I knew it. Marge's face was turning red. That's enough. But I wasn't done. I held up another piece of paper. And here's the best part. This is a copy of a complaint that was filed against Marge 3 years ago for attempting to illegally claim someone else's property through the same shady tactics she's trying to use on me. Gasps filled the room. Even the lawyer looked like he wanted to disappear. I turned to the crowd. How many of you have been fined for ridiculous reasons? How many of you have been threatened with lawsuits by this woman? Slowly, hands started going up. People started talking. Anger replaced fear. And just like that, the illusion of Marge's power began to crack. She stood up, shaking with rage. This is my community. I have spent years keeping it in order. Without me, you'd all be living in chaos. But no one was listening anymore. People were demanding answers, questioning fees, demanding financial records. I stepped back, letting the chaos unfold. Marge tried to regain control, but it was too late. The people she had bullied for years had finally realized they didn't have to take it anymore. I left the meeting knowing one thing for certain. Marge was finished. She just didn't know it yet. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread like wildfire. By the next morning, the entire town was buzzing about what had gone down. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now demanding answers. Homeowners were questioning the legitimacy of their fees, calling the county offices, and digging through years of paperwork. And at the center of it all was Marge, scrambling to maintain control as her carefully constructed empire began to crumble. I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight, but I didn't expect her to be so desperate. It started with the letters. By noon, a new notice had been posted on my cabin door, this time written in all capital letters, as if screaming on paper would somehow make her case stronger. Final notice: cease and desist immediately. You are in violation of HOA regulations and are subject to legal action. Compliance is mandatory. Failure to cooperate will result in escalation. Escalation? That was a new one. I had barely finished reading when my phone rang. It was Rick from the county clerk's office. You really stirred up a hornet's nest, Jack, he said, sounding half impressed, half worried. Marge just called my office demanding we expedite her request to claim your property as HOA land. I rubbed my temples. And we told her that wasn't how the law works. But she's not giving up. Now she's trying to argue that your land was donated to the HOA years ago. That was a bold claim, considering I had the original deed sitting on my kitchen table. Let me guess, I said. She has no proof? Rick chuckled. Not a shred. But that won't stop her from trying. I wasn't surprised. Marge had already shown she was willing to forge documents, call the cops on me, and fine people into submission. She was the type of person who thrived on intimidation. The problem was, I wasn't the kind of person who scared easily. Later that afternoon, I decided to pay her a visit. If she wanted to escalate things, fine. I'd escalate them right back. I drove to the Willow Creek HOA office, a small, overly polished building that looked way too fancy for a neighborhood association. As soon as I stepped inside, the receptionist, a nervous-looking woman in her 50s, flinched at the sight of me. "I'm here to see Marge," I said. She hesitated. I don't think she's available." "Then I'll wait." Before she could protest, the office door swung open and Marge stormed out, her face set in a deep scowl. "What do you want, Carter?" I held up her ridiculous letter. "Came to personally return this. Thought you'd appreciate the courtesy." Her eyes narrowed. "You're trespassing." I laughed. "Oh, that's rich. You've been trespassing on my land since day one." Marge stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You don't understand what you're getting yourself into. I have powerful connections. People in this town respect me." "Funny," I said, crossing my arms. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like everyone's starting to realize what a fraud you are." She clenched her jaw, but I could see the panic behind her eyes. She was losing control, and she knew it. "Walk away," she said, her voice tight. "Sell the property, take the money, and leave. This isn't worth it." I tilted my head. "And if I don't?" Marge smirked, but it was forced. "Then things get complicated." I leaned in. "They already are." She turned sharply and marched back into her office, slamming the door behind her. The receptionist gave me an apologetic look, but I was already heading for the exit. Marge wasn't backing down. But neither was I. The next move was hers, and I didn't have to wait long to see what it was. That night, I was woken up by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch just in time to see a tow truck backing up toward my cabin. At first, I thought maybe someone had taken a wrong turn, but then I saw the driver get out and start hooking a chain around my truck. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I called out. The driver flinched but kept working. "Got orders to tow this vehicle. HOA violation." I barked out a laugh. "This isn't HOA property." He hesitated, looking unsure. "Look, man, I'm just doing my job. I got paperwork saying this truck needs to be removed." I stepped closer. "Yeah, show me the paperwork." The driver fumbled with a clipboard, but before he could hand it over, another car pulled up. This time, it wasn't a tow truck, it was a police cruiser. Perfect timing. 2 officers stepped out, and I immediately recognized one of them from the incident with Marge's first 911 stunt. He sighed when he saw me. "Mr. Carter, what's going on now?" I gestured toward the tow truck. "This guy is trying to steal my truck on orders from Marge." The officer turned to the driver. "Do you have any legal documentation for this tow?" The driver handed over the clipboard. The officer scanned it, then his face hardened. He looked at the tow driver. "This isn't a legal order. Take your truck and leave." The driver didn't argue. He unhooked my truck, muttering an apology before driving off. Then the officer turned to me. "I'm guessing this is more HOA nonsense." I nodded. "She's getting desperate." He sighed. "She's crossing into criminal territory. If she tries something like this again, press charges." That was exactly what I planned to do. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Enough was enough. If Marge wanted a legal battle, I'd give her one. I filed a harassment complaint, along with a restraining order to keep her off my property. But the real dagger came when I sent a formal complaint to the county about her fraudulent attempts to seize my land. By the end of the day, the investigation was officially opened. The cracks in her power were turning into full-blown fractures. And soon, they'd break her completely. Marge had finally crossed the line, and now it was time to make sure she faced the consequences. The county had opened an official investigation into her fraudulent land claims, and once word spread, everything started unraveling at an astonishing pace. The town was no longer afraid of her, and it was as if everyone had been waiting for the moment to turn against her. People started speaking out. Homeowners who had been bullied, fined, and intimidated for years. Former HOA board members came forward, revealing how Marge had rigged elections to stay in power, manipulated HOA funds for her own benefit, and even threatened to sue those who questioned her authority. The county officials didn't waste any time. Within days, they found enough evidence of misconduct to suspend all HOA operations while they conducted a deeper audit. That meant Marge had lost her biggest weapon. She no longer had the power to issue fines, send enforcement letters, or file complaints under the HOA's name. It was the first real blow to her empire, but it wasn't the last. I made sure of that. After speaking with my lawyer, I filed an official lawsuit against Marge and the HOA for harassment, property interference, and fraudulent claims. It was a rock-solid case. The evidence was overwhelming: fake documents, illegal fines, false police reports. The restraining order I had filed earlier only made things worse for her. The lawsuit didn't just put her under legal scrutiny. It also meant she had to step down as HOA president while the case was pending. The moment the HOA board heard the news, they turned on her. No one wanted to be dragged down with her, especially not with an investigation looming over their heads. It was like watching rats flee a sinking ship. Board members who had once blindly supported her were now claiming they had been misled or forced to go along with her decisions. Some even reached out to offer me statements for my lawsuit, hoping it would protect them from getting dragged into the legal mess. Marge, of course, refused to go quietly. She showed up at my property one last time, despite the restraining order. I saw her coming before she even stepped out of her car, and I was already on the phone with the cops when she stormed up to my porch. "This isn't over," she screeched, her voice raw with desperation. "You think you've won? You're just a stupid redneck squatting on land that belongs to the community." I leaned against the railing, watching her meltdown with amusement. "Pretty sure the county, the law, and every person in this town disagrees with you." Her face twisted in rage. "You don't belong here. People like you don't understand how real communities work." I let out a slow chuckle. "Oh, I understand plenty. I understand that you conned and bullied people into thinking they had no choice but to obey you. I understand that you forged documents and lied to law enforcement. And I understand that in about 5 minutes, the cops are going to show up and escort you off my land." She opened her mouth to fire back, but the sound of sirens cut her off. Her head snapped toward the road, and for the first time, I saw something other than anger in her eyes. Fear. Real, genuine fear. The same fear she had forced onto so many people for years. When the officers stepped out of their car, she tried to regain control. "Officers, this man is a danger to the community. He has threatened me, harassed me." The lead officer, the same one who had dealt with her false 911 call, held up a hand. "Marge, we've got a restraining order on file against you. You're trespassing and you were warned." Her confidence wavered. "But I was just. You're under arrest." It was almost surreal watching it happen. One moment, Marge was standing there, defiant as ever. The next, she was being cuffed, her face twisting into a mix of disbelief and horror. "You can't do this. I am the HOA." The officer didn't even flinch. "Not anymore, you're not." They placed her in the back of the cruiser, and just like that, she was gone. With Marge out of the picture, the HOA collapsed completely. Residents voted to dissolve it entirely, reclaiming their rights as individual homeowners. People who had been forced to pay ridiculous fines were refunded, and the county put measures in place to prevent similar scams from happening again. And as for me? Well, I got the best kind of revenge. Marge's house, her pride and joy, the symbol of her so-called power, went up for sale to cover the legal costs from all the lawsuits piling up against her. The very home she had ruled from like a queen was now on the market. And guess who bought it? That's right, me. I didn't even need a place in town, but the satisfaction of owning Marge's house was too good to pass up. After everything she had put people through, seeing her legacy reduced to a property listing was the perfect ending. The best part? I didn't even keep it. I threw a massive block party, invited every homeowner she had ever bullied, and then flipped the house for a hefty profit. The money went right back into fixing up my cabin, ensuring that I never had to deal with HOA nonsense again. Now my property is finally mine, just as it always should have been. I hunt when I want, fish when I want, and enjoy the peace and quiet that I fought so hard to keep. And Marge? Last I heard, she moved out of state to avoid further legal trouble. Good riddance. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that some people think power is permanent. They think fear will always keep them in control. But the truth is, when people stand up, when they refuse to be bullied, even the mightiest tyrants can fall. And there's nothing more satisfying than watching them crash.